Nathaniel Carter adjusted his coat as he stepped out of his sleek black sedan, the crisp evening air wrapping around him like a silent observer. The neighborhood of Woodridge Heights was quiet, the rhythmic hum of distant traffic the only break in the stillness. He had just returned from an exhausting day in court, his mind weighed down by the cases he had presided over. All he wanted was the solace of his home. As he reached for his briefcase from the back seat, the sudden glare of flashing blue and red lights washed over him, cutting through the darkness. A sharp voice shattered the silence. "Hands where I can see them. Step away from the vehicle." Nathaniel turned slowly, his heart pounding, though his expression remained composed. Two officers approached, their hands hovering near their holsters. The younger one, Officer Harper, had her gaze locked on him, suspicion written all over her face. "Sir, we need to ask you a few questions," she stated firmly, her tone carrying an edge of authority. Nathaniel exhaled sharply. He had dealt with law enforcement for years, but from the other side of the bench. Now, standing under the accusatory glare of the officers, he felt the sting of an all-too-familiar reality. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm yet firm. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description," Harper responded. "We need to see some identification." Nathaniel frowned, his fingers tightening around the handle of his briefcase. "This is my car. I can provide proof of ownership." Before he could reach into his pocket, Harper's stance shifted. "Keep your hands where I can see them," she warned, her voice sharp. Nathaniel froze, an icy frustration gripping his chest. "I am Judge Nathaniel Carter," he stated, enunciating every word with the precision of a gavel striking a bench. "I live in this neighborhood. My identification is in my wallet. May I retrieve it?" Harper exchanged a glance with her partner, Officer Mitchell, whose hesitation was evident. But Harper's suspicion did not waver. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," she ordered again. A small crowd had begun to gather, neighbors stepping out of their homes, drawn by the flashing lights and tense voices. Among them was Linda, a longtime resident who recognized Nathaniel immediately. "That's Judge Carter," she called out, her voice laced with disbelief. Others murmured in agreement, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. But Harper seemed unmoved. Nathaniel's patience thinned. "Officer, this is a grave mistake," he said, his voice steady but laced with restrained anger. Harper, however, had already made up her mind. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Gasps rippled through the crowd as cold metal clamped around Nathaniel's wrists. The weight of the handcuffs pressed against his skin, a stark contrast to the authority he wielded in a courtroom. As Mitchell read him his rights, Nathaniel's gaze burned into Harper's, not with fear, but with a quiet, simmering defiance. "You have no idea what you have just done," he murmured. The air was thick with tension, the murmurs of the crowd swelling. Phones were raised, recording every second. This was more than a routine stop. This was a moment that would not be forgotten. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Nathaniel's wrists, a sharp contrast to the warm evening air. He remained still, his breath measured, refusing to give in to the indignity of the moment. Around him, murmurs of disbelief rippled through the growing crowd. "Are you serious?" Linda's voice cut through the tension, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "That is Judge Carter. You cannot be arresting him." Other voices joined hers, outrage swelling like an unstoppable tide. Jake, a young man from the neighborhood, raised his phone higher. "I'm live streaming this," he announced. "People need to see this." Officer Harper glanced at the crowd, her jaw tightening. She turned to Mitchell, who shifted uneasily beside her. "We are following procedure," she insisted, though doubt flickered in her eyes for the briefest moment. Nathaniel, his hands still restrained, exhaled slowly. "Procedure," he repeated, his voice edged with controlled anger. "Tell me, officer, at what point in your procedure did you verify the owner of this vehicle?" Harper hesitated. "Sir, we received a report." "A report," Nathaniel interrupted, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "And you assumed that I, a black man standing beside his own car, must be a criminal." A hush fell over the crowd. The accusation hung in the air like a heavy weight, undeniable and suffocating. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. Harper, maybe we should. But before he could finish, another voice rang out. Nathaniel, are you all right? An older man stepped forward. George, a longtime neighbor who had known Nathaniel for years. His face was lined with concern, his stance protective. I am fine, George, Nathaniel replied, his tone even. But I do not believe these officers understand the gravity of their mistake. Harper's grip on her belt tightened. Sir, we are conducting an investigation, she said, her voice more defensive now. If there has been a misunderstanding, we will clear it up at the station. Nathaniel let out a bitter chuckle. A misunderstanding? His voice hardened. You had every opportunity to ask questions before placing these cuffs on me. Yet, you chose to assume the worst. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. Someone shouted, Take those cuffs off him now. Holloway, the precinct captain, arrived at that moment, stepping out of his patrol car with an unreadable expression. His gaze swept over the scene, the flashing lights, the agitated neighbors, the judge in handcuffs. His face darkened. What is going on here? He demanded. Harper straightened, her stance rigid. Sir, we detained this man under suspicion of vehicle theft. The car matches the description of. Holloway's sharp gaze landed on Nathaniel, and the recognition was immediate. His face paled. Judge Carter, he said slowly. This is a mistake. Nathaniel held his stare. Yes, Captain. A mistake that should never have happened. Holloway turned to Harper, his jaw tightening. Remove the cuffs. Now. Harper hesitated for just a second before nodding to Mitchell, who quickly stepped forward, unlocking the restraints. Nathaniel brought his hands forward, rubbing the red marks left on his skin. Though he was free, the damage had already been done. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Nathaniel's eyes, steady and unwavering, remained fixed on Holloway. What do you call this, Captain? He asked, his voice low and deliberate. A minor error? An unfortunate oversight. Holloway inhaled deeply, his expression grim. Judge Carter, I sincerely apologize. This should not have happened. Nathaniel let out a slow, measured breath. No, Captain, it should not have. The crowd murmured in agreement, their frustration palpable. The tension had not eased. It had merely shifted, now resting heavily on the shoulders of the officers who had just been forced to confront their failure. Harper avoided Nathaniel's gaze, but the weight of his words was impossible to ignore. Nathaniel turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. This is not just about me, he said, his voice carrying over the hushed street. This is about a system that allows bias to guide judgment instead of truth. A system that assumes guilt before innocence, especially when the suspect looks like me. Holloway said nothing. The truth, as stark as it was, left no room for argument. Nathaniel took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only Holloway to hear. What are you going to do about it, Captain? Holloway hesitated. In that moment, he understood that this incident was no longer just about one mistake. It was about something much larger, something that could no longer be ignored, and Nathaniel was not going to let it be forgotten. Nathaniel stood in the dim glow of the streetlights, rubbing his wrists where the cold steel had left faint red marks. Though he was no longer restrained, the weight of the humiliation lingered. Around him, the murmuring crowd had yet to disperse, their faces etched with anger and disbelief. Linda, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glared at Harper. You humiliated an innocent man in front of his own home, she spat. And now what? You just walk away like nothing happened. Harper, still stiff with tension, opened her mouth to respond, but Holloway spoke first. Officer Harper will submit a full report, he said, his voice clipped, as though trying to control the damage. There will be an internal review. Nathaniel gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. A report, he repeated. And what exactly will it say, Captain? That a respected judge was treated like a criminal because two officers could not be bothered to verify basic facts before making an arrest. Holloway exhaled through his nose, the pressure of the moment evident in the tightness of his shoulders. Judge Carter, I understand your frustration. Nathaniel's sharp gaze cut through him. Do you? He asked, his voice steady but unyielding. Tell me, Captain, when was the last time you had your hands shackled in front of your neighbors? Your character reduced to a set of false assumptions? Holloway had no answer. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of passing traffic in the distance. The reality of the night settled like a storm cloud over the officers, over the neighborhood, over everyone. Harper took a breath, as if gathering herself. "Judge Carter," she said, and for the first time, her voice lacked its earlier edge. Nathaniel raised a hand, stopping her. "Save it," he said, his voice firm. "Your apology, if you ever choose to give one, is not for me alone. It is for every person who has been judged unfairly, treated as a suspect for no reason other than the color of their skin." Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. Whether it was frustration, guilt, or a battle within herself, Nathaniel could not tell. A movement from the crowd drew his attention. George, the veteran neighbor who had spoken earlier, stepped forward, his stance resolute. "We are not letting this slide," he declared, his deep voice carrying authority. "This neighborhood deserves better. Our kids deserve better." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Someone called out, "This is not over," and another shouted, "Justice for Nathaniel." Jake, still holding his phone, announced, "The video is already trending." People are furious. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had spent years upholding justice in the courtroom, believing in the law's ability to right wrongs. But tonight had exposed an ugly truth. Justice was not blind, at least not when it came to people who looked like him. The flashing red and blue lights finally began to fade as the remaining officers retreated. But the damage had been done. This was not just an isolated mistake. It was a symptom of something deeper, something that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. Nathaniel turned back to his neighbors, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "We will not let this moment pass without meaning," he said. "If they want a report, we will give them one, but it will not come from their department. It will come from this community." George nodded in approval. "Then we start now. We organize." A spark had been lit. Harper, still standing nearby, watched the scene unfold. Her usual composure seemed shaken. For the first time, she appeared unsure, as if realizing that tonight was not just another routine call. It was a turning point. And Nathaniel knew one thing for certain. The night air was thick with tension, yet beneath it, a current of determination rippled through the gathered crowd. Nathaniel stood at the center, his presence commanding yet calm. He was not just a man wronged. He was a symbol of something much larger, and everyone knew it. Linda stepped closer, her voice filled with urgency. "Nathaniel, they cannot just walk away from this. You know that, right?" Nathaniel nodded, his expression grave. "I know, Linda, and they will not." Across from him, Captain Holloway remained rooted in place, his face tight with unease. He had handled countless incidents throughout his career, but none had spiraled out of control quite like this. The weight of Nathaniel's words and the murmurs of the crowd pressed in on him, demanding something he was not prepared to give: accountability. "Captain," Nathaniel continued, his voice steady but firm, "this department cannot treat my wrongful arrest as an unfortunate mishap and move on. It is bigger than that. Do you understand?" Holloway hesitated for only a moment before responding. "I do." Nathaniel's gaze remained unwavering. "Then tell me, what happens next?" The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Holloway glanced at Harper, whose face was still pale, her once unshakable confidence nowhere to be found. "I will personally review the incident," Holloway said at last. "There will be consequences." Nathaniel let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Consequences?" he repeated. "What does that mean exactly? A quiet reassignment? A temporary suspension?" He took a step closer. "Or will this be one of those situations that gets buried under bureaucratic paperwork until the public forgets?" Holloway exhaled sharply, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I assure you, Judge Carter, that is not how I intend to handle this." "Then say it," Nathaniel pushed. "Right here, in front of this community. Acknowledge what happened tonight. Admit that it was wrong." Holloway's shoulders tensed. This was not how he had envisioned the night ending. He had hoped to defuse the situation quietly, to de-escalate. But Nathaniel was not allowing that. Not this time. A long silence stretched between them, and then, At last, Holloway gave a slow nod. "You are right," he admitted, his voice quieter but resolute. "This should not have happened." He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the concerned faces. "This department is supposed to protect and serve every member of this community. We failed in that duty tonight." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some surprised, others still skeptical. "And Harper?" Nathaniel pressed. "What will happen to her?" Harper stiffened at the mention of her name, her jaw tightening. But she did not look away. Holloway hesitated before answering. "She will be investigated and held accountable for her actions." Nathaniel studied him for a moment, gauging the sincerity in his words. "We will be watching," he said finally, "and we will not be silent." Holloway nodded once before turning to Harper. "Remove yourself from the scene," he ordered. Harper's face was unreadable as she stepped back. There was no protest, no justification, only silent retreat. As the officers withdrew, the tension did not fade. If anything, it hardened into something more lasting, a resolve among the people who had witnessed the night's injustice. Nathaniel turned to his neighbors, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "This is not the end of the conversation. If we do not demand change, nothing will change." Jake held up his phone. "People are already talking about it online. The video is spreading fast." Nathaniel gave a firm nod. "Good. Then we make sure the world listens." George clapped a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "You are not alone in this fight." Nathaniel looked around, taking in the faces of those standing beside him. This was not just about what had happened to him. It was about what had been happening for far too long. And now, the world was watching. A reckoning had begun. The weight of the night's events had not yet lifted. Captain Holloway stood rigid, his jaw tight as he turned to Officer Harper. His voice, though restrained, carried an unmistakable edge. "Harper, did you even verify the vehicle's registration before taking action?" Harper's lips parted, but no words came. She swallowed hard, her once firm demeanor unraveling beneath the heavy scrutiny. I was going to Captain, but you didn't." Holloway cut in, his tone sharp as a blade. Silence fell over the crowd. The flashing lights of patrol cars bathed the street in cold, shifting hues of blue and red. The very people meant to uphold the law were now standing in the harsh glare of accountability. Judge Nathaniel Carter, now freed from the cold steel of the handcuffs, rubbed his wrists. Though his body was no longer restrained, the injustice of the moment still clung to him like a second skin. His piercing gaze locked on a Holloway. "Captain," he began, his voice measured and deliberate. "What do you call this? A minor misunderstanding?" Holloway exhaled, attempting to maintain composure. "Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize. This was a grave mistake, and it will be addressed." "A mistake?" Nathaniel's voice did not rise, but it did not need to. The quiet strength behind his words sliced through the air like a scalpel. "Whose mistake, Captain? Officer Harper's for acting recklessly? Or the system you oversee, a system that allows bias to guide behavior instead of justice?" Holloway's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of Nathaniel's words pressing down on him. He wanted to defend his officers, to shield them from the public fury mounting around them. But the truth was undeniable. Nathaniel stepped forward, his presence unshaken. "I do not care for empty apologies or bureaucratic promises. I want to know, right now, how this system will change to ensure this does not happen again. Not just to me, but to anyone." The crowd murmured in agreement. They were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses. Holloway felt their eyes burning into him, waiting for his response. The moment was bigger than just him. He could feel it. "I give you my word," Holloway said, his voice slow and deliberate. "Every necessary action will be taken. Harper will be held accountable for her decisions tonight, and I will ensure that no one else has to endure what you did." Nathaniel remained silent for a long moment, his sharp gaze unyielding. Finally, he spoke, his words carrying the weight of generations before him. "I will hold you to that, Captain," he said, his tone as cold as steel. "But remember this. Your promises will be judged by your actions, not by the hollow words I have heard too many times before." Holloway nodded, but he knew this was far from over. This incident was no longer just an isolated mistake. It was a reflection of something much larger, a crack in the foundation of a system that could no longer be ignored. And Nathaniel Carter, with his unshakable stance and commanding voice, had forced him to confront that truth. Yet, even as Holloway tried to regain control, the moment slipped further from his grasp. Jake, the young man who had been recording from the start, raised his phone. "Captain, we have evidence. This entire thing is being live-streamed. People are watching, and they will not stay silent." Holloway's breath caught in his throat. The realization settled upon him like a lead weight. This was no longer a private matter. The world was watching. Nathaniel turned his attention back to the captain. "A private apology will not repair what happened tonight," he stated. "This is not just about me and your officers. This is about a system, your system, that continues to fail people like me over and over again." Holloway inhaled deeply. "I understand your anger, Judge Carter. I assure you, this will be handled through the proper channels." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "The proper channels?" he repeated. "Captain, I have seen too many cases disappear into the black hole of internal procedures. No, that is not enough. I want transparency. I want you to publicly acknowledge your department's mistakes. And I want a clear plan of action, one that ensures this never happens again." Holloway hesitated. His eyes darted toward the crowd, then back to Nathaniel. He knew any misstep now could have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself, but for the entire department. "Bringing this fully into the public, I could damage trust in the justice system," he argued, though the words felt weak even as he spoke them. Nathaniel let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Trust?" His voice was laced with incredulity. "Captain, do you truly believe this community still has trust in a system that made me a suspect solely because of the color of my skin?" Holloway had no response. Nathaniel took another step closer. "Trust is not built by covering up mistakes. It is built by confronting them and correcting them openly." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, Nathaniel turned his sharp gaze to Harper. "Do you have anything to say, Officer Harper?" he asked. "Or will you continue hiding behind your superior?" Harper's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to explain herself. But what could she say? That she had been afraid? That she had let years of conditioning dictate her judgment? None of it would change what had happened. None of it would erase the damage done. For the first time that night, she felt completely exposed. After a long pause, she finally found her voice. "I think," she began, but her words faltered. Her hands clenched at her sides. "I think we need to clarify everything before the community. It is our responsibility." Holloway studied her closely. There was no arrogance left in her tone, no attempt at justification, only the barest acknowledgement of the truth. Nathaniel gave a slow nod. "Good," he said. "Then let us start with that." Holloway exhaled. "We will hold a public press conference," he announced. "We will acknowledge our mistakes, and I will commit to implementing training and reforms to ensure this does not happen again." Nathaniel remained unflinching. "I will be watching your actions, Captain. And let me warn you, if I see even the slightest attempt at deception, I will take this entire story to the media myself. I have nothing to lose. But you do." His words hung in the air like a final warning, thick with unspoken consequences. Holloway nodded, knowing he had no choice but to follow through. This was no longer about one night or one mistake. It was about something much larger. Harper, standing in quiet shame, felt the weight of it all crash down upon her. Her choices that night had not only tarnished Nathaniel's dignity, but had shaken the very foundation of what she believed she stood for. And in the days to come, as the world learned what had happened, the fallout would be greater than any of them could have imagined. The video of Nathaniel Carter standing in the harsh glow of flashing police lights, his hands bound in cold steel, his dignity stripped away, had spread like wildfire. Hashtags demanding justice surged across social media, flooding platforms with calls for accountability. But this was no longer just about Nathaniel. His story had become a symbol, one thread woven into the broader tapestry of systemic injustice. The world was watching, and Nathaniel knew he had a choice: allow the moment to fade into yet another forgotten outrage, or seize it to ignite something greater. He chose the latter. Determined, Nathaniel organized a community meeting at the Woodridge Heights Cultural Center. not just to set the record straight, but to spark a conversation that extended beyond his experience. This was about a collective struggle, one that had burdened far too many for far too long. The Cultural Center's Grand Hall was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls, standing shoulder to shoulder. The crowd was not just composed of neighbors but included journalists, activists, and individuals drawn by the urgency of the moment. Nathaniel stepped onto the stage, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. He felt their anticipation, their frustration, but most of all, their hope. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady yet warm. "What happened to me that night was not just a personal mistake. It was a reflection of a system that repeatedly fails us. It is about the assumptions made, the prejudices that persist, and the reality that black men and women are too often seen as suspects before they are seen as human beings." A hush fell over the audience, every word sinking in with a gravity that could not be ignored. Nathaniel recounted the night, the humiliation, the fear, the bitter realization that no amount of status or respectability could shield him from bias. But he did not dwell in anger. He shifted the conversation to action. "We cannot rewrite the past," he said, his voice resolute, "but we can shape the future. And that starts today, with acknowledging these issues, confronting them, and committing to real change." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eyes gleamed with the fire of conviction. Then, from the back of the hall, a figure stirred. Officer Harper. She sat with her head slightly bowed, her presence almost an act of defiance against her own discomfort. When Nathaniel turned his gaze toward her, the entire room followed. "Officer Harper," he said, his tone measured, "would you be willing to speak?" A collective breath was held as all eyes fell upon her. For a moment, she hesitated. The weight of scrutiny pressed down on her. But then, slowly, she rose to her feet and made her way toward the stage. When she turned to face the crowd, she was met with a wall of skepticism. Some looked at her with outright disdain. Others simply waited, wondering if she had anything meaningful to say, or if this would be another hollow attempt at damage control. Harper gripped the microphone, her fingers tightening around the metal. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked its usual confidence. "I came here tonight not to justify what I did, but to acknowledge it," she began. "I made a decision that night based on bias, whether I recognized it at the time or not. And for that, I owe not just an apology to Judge Carter, but to this entire community." The room remained silent, listening. "But words are not enough," she continued, straightening her posture. "Starting tomorrow, I am committing to undergoing extensive training on implicit bias. More than that, I will work with this community to establish an open dialogue between law enforcement and the people we serve." Her eyes flickered to Nathaniel, then back to the crowd. "I know that my actions have damaged trust, and trust cannot be restored overnight. But I am not here to simply apologize and disappear. I am here to take responsibility and to do the work necessary to ensure that what happened to Judge Carter does not happen to anyone else." Skepticism lingered in the air, but her words had landed. Some nodded in cautious approval. Others remained rigid, unwilling to be swayed so easily. Harper continued, her voice growing steadier. "I have spent my career believing I stood for justice. But that night, I undermined the very thing I swore to protect. I cannot erase the past, but I can dedicate myself to being better, not just for myself, but for the system I represent." She turned back to Nathaniel, her expression sincere. "Judge Carter, thank you for holding me accountable. If you had not, I might never have confronted the flaws in myself." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then, ever so slightly, he nodded. It was not forgiveness, at least not yet, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes, that was the first step. As the meeting concluded, the conversation did not end. Social media exploded with clips of Nathaniel's speech, Harper's public reckoning, and the impassioned discussions that followed. Hashtags like #JusticeForNathaniel and #EndRacialBias dominated the online landscape, turning his story into a national movement. One video in particular went viral. It featured George, an elderly resident of Woodridge Heights, his voice filled with the weight of experience. "This isn't just about Nathaniel," he said, his weathered face illuminated by the glow of a camera phone. This is about all of us, about the need for a system that serves everyone fairly. We, the people of Woodridge Heights, refuse to stay silent any longer. The pressure mounted. The police department, now under intense scrutiny, was forced to address the growing demands for change. A public press conference was scheduled, with Holloway and Harper at the forefront, facing the community they had wronged. Yet even as Harper committed to reform, she continued to face criticism. Some questioned her sincerity, while others believed real change could not come from within the system itself. Nathaniel, in interviews, remained firm. Change does not come from apologies, he stated. It comes from action, from transparency, from an unwavering commitment to doing better, not just today, but every single day after. The meeting may have ended, but the movement it sparked had only begun. Nathaniel felt a quiet sense of hope, but hope, he knew, was not enough. It had to be nurtured, sustained, fought for. As night fell over Woodridge Heights, the echoes of that evening lingered. A community had found its voice. A movement had taken its first breath, and Nathaniel Carter, with the weight of history behind him and the fire of determination within him, walked forward, not just as a man who had been wronged, but as a guide for those still fighting. His story was not just his own. It was a mirror reflecting the struggles of so many others. Injustice, prejudice, a system in need of reckoning, asterisk. How do you feel about the way Nathaniel confronted this challenge? If you were in his shoes, what would you do? Let us know in the comments, asterisk. If this story resonated with you, show your support by liking the video, sharing it to amplify this message, and subscribing to our channel for more powerful and thought-provoking stories. Thank you for being part of this conversation.